So, as part of a project I've been working on, I started going back through some of my old setup ideas, since so much of it had to do with copying Neil Peart's drum setup. Now, when I was in high school, I had my drums set up a lot like this. And key to that setup was the ability to mount my ride cymbal and my China cymbal underneath other cymbals such as the splash and the crash without having to have extra stands and without having a lot of money to buy a whole bunch of different boom stands. So in the spirit of that, I thought we would take a look at the modern approach to solving that problem versus what I had to use back then. Mounting two cymbals onto the same tripod in roughly the same footprint like that was pretty easy because there seemed to be a widespread proliferation of Ludwig 1400 lightweight cymbal stands. And one of the notable features about these little skinny stands was that the topmost section was basically a solid piece of 3/8" rod, which was small enough that you could actually poke it down through the center hole of a cymbal. And as long as you had like a fender washer and a hi-hat felt on top of the tube underneath that upper section, you could rest a cymbal right on top of there. If you look through Neil Peart's kits before he started drilling out his ride cymbal in order to accommodate a larger stand, and we'll get to that, he was using whatever piece of gear was skinny enough to fit through the hole in the cymbal and get the job done, which led to him having kind of a mishmash of hardware from various manufacturers, no matter which drum company he might have been endorsing at the time. Even with such simple hardware, there were still plenty of solutions to deal with problems like how do you get a Wuhan China cymbal to stay in its kind of upturned position without flopping around all over the place. And the solution I came up with was pretty simple. I used a cowbell bracket. Now these days, most cowbells have the bracket, the mounting bracket, actually welded onto the bell itself. But it used to be that a lot of cowbells just had kind of a steel strap welded to the back of it, and then this part of the clamp assembly would be a separate doodad, and you would thread all of these things over the top of whatever mounting post you were going to use, tighten it down, and that would pull the whole affair together and lock it in. You could get one of those clamps separately, so I got one or two of them. I think one for actually mounting stupid cowbells, and a couple of extras for dealing with that China cymbal. And basically what I did was I would set the stop point on the clamp where I wanted it, put enough cymbal felts underneath that it would keep the action of the wing screw and everything from interfering with the bell cup of the China cymbal, then thread the China cymbal up around that, then put the bottom felt on, and then stuff it into the stand. You could pinch, because that clamp was there, you could pinch the entire thing down, tighten the actual mounting nut on the cymbal stand, and that would hold the China cymbal relatively tight in its upright position no matter how hard you smack it. And of course it was a Wuhan, so eventually it would crack. Now the ride cymbal was less of a problem because it naturally just hangs in that nice flat Neil Pearty position. So I didn't think too much about it as long as I had a decent felt underneath the cup of the thing, because it was at the time a 20-inch Zildjian mini cup, so there wasn't a lot to work with there. But it sat nice on the stand, it played well, and of course allowed me to either float a splash cymbal or alternatively a crash cymbal, depending on how I was specifically setting up the drums. Now these days I don't have any of those Ludwig stands left, so I had to come up with a new way to deal with the same old problem. Remember, like Dave Chappelle says, modern problems call for modern solutions. Now, while I am sure there are still some manufacturers that make a cymbal upright that is small enough to fit down through the ordinary 1/2 inch mounting hole in a cymbal. Most manufacturers are starting to go over to just generally a 1/2 inch knurled rod like this. And that doesn't really fit into the hole in a cymbal, at least not without risking some serious damage. So we want to do everything we can to avoid compromising the cymbal if we can. Now, I've always wondered about this route, and so I finally broke down and got one, which is the DW angle adjustable cymbal stacker. Now, how this little critter works, and by the way, they're not normally this long, that's part of the hack here. So you got this little doodad right here. It'll come off. And this is just a simple clamp and, oh, what do they call this? A simple clamp and cymbal seat that fits on top of this rod. Now, the rod itself that actually comes with this thing is only about half as long, and it's made out of aluminum, which makes it significantly lighter. Here, I'm using a full-length cymbal arm, and of course it's a bit heavier because it's made out of steel, but it gives me the height that I need to come off of this cymbal. Otherwise, the splash cymbal would only be up to about here, maybe. This has a much smaller version of that cymbal tilter clamp. It's designed to fit on this very skinny little knurled rod right here. So, put it on there, clamp it down, Bob's your uncle. Now, when we take the bottom cymbal off of there, we see we have just an ordinary cymbal seat, except that instead of having a threaded top on it like a typical DW cymbal seat, it has a special version of it which actually replaces the one that comes in your stand. So, for example, this is the actual cymbal head, the tilter head, that used to be in here, and all I did was undo the bolt, pull this one out, pop the new one in, reinsert the bolt, and everything goes back together nicely. So when it's time to set up, everything goes together pretty simply. Plop my ride cymbal on there. Put my upright on there. And I want everything to be nice and straight up. So I just try to line it up by eyeball. And try not to poke myself in the eye while I'm doing it. Take our second cymbal seat, mount it on there, and try not to abrade the underside of your cymbal with it. Make sure you leave enough room for the thing to swing. I mean, in this case, it's a splash cymbal, so how much swing does it really need? Only as much as Buddy Rich could put into it. I have also used this with a crash cymbal on top of the ride cymbal in a more kind of classic Neil-Peart setup, and wailed away on it, and it didn't seem to mind. So, even though it seems a little bit wobbly and wonky, thus far it's holding up. If anything changes, I'll be sure to report that. Now, if for some reason you are unable to get around the problem of having to enlarge the center hole in your cymbal, I'll show you how I did that with this setup right here. Now, of course, there's nothing out of the ordinary about this. Just an ordinary cymbal tilter head wing nut and felt assembly. Or if it's abbreviated, an ASSI. This works in much the same way as the Ludwig's, only the mounting point is a bit more sophisticated than the old days. Alright, so cymbal felt goes on top of here, which provides an adequate surface for just plopping the felt directly onto it. And then the cymbal, with its enlarged center hole, fits over the 1/2 inch rod. And in place of a cowbell clamp, now everything has a memory lock on it, so you can just throw another felt on top of that to keep it from grinding into your cymbal. And you can just use the memory lock as the downward clamp to hold that cymbal in place instead of the cowbell clamp rig that I used to use. Now, how did I go about enlarging this center hole? Well, first of all, it's worth noting that I chose to do this on a Wuhan and not on my 22-inch Paragon ride. And if I can avoid drilling holes in my 22-inch Paragon ride, I will thank myself for my concern. Now, in the old days, if I had to enlarge the hole in a cymbal, I would use an ordinary drill bit that was made for cutting, at least made for cutting metal. They might be dual purpose that were good for wood and metal, but you don't want to use wood bits. Wood bits have a shape to them that doesn't really work well for metal. Now these days, I don't mess around with any of that. I use what some would call a unibit or a step bit. This is the larger of the two that I have. Now how I approached it was, if I'm trying to get a 1/2-inch hole that's not working to fit around a 1/2-inch rod, then on the step bit, well, first I tried it out using the 1/2-inch side just to make sure we were actually at the right size. And the factory hole that was drilled in the Wuhan was a little bit smaller than 1/2 inch, but enlarging it to the full 1/2 inch didn't make any difference. The cymbal stand still wouldn't pass through it. So the next increment on this particular step bit, since it goes in 1/16 inch increments, is 9/16. So I took it only as far as the 9/16 part. And the thing about a step bit is if you just start creeping into the next size up, it'll actually deburr that side of the cut, whichever side it happens to be on. So I gave it a little spin on both sides of the cymbal hole after I was done, just to make sure I didn't have any sharp pokey bits hanging around the hole. End result, I got a nice, clean, evenly drilled hole in the cymbal that's large enough to fit around that cymbal stand. And of course, I chose the Wuhan cymbal because it's cheap, it's experimental. If I screw it up, no great loss. I didn't pay that much for it to begin with. Now, this last setup here is kind of a throwback to something that I always wanted to get for my setup, but never really got around to it. And this is basically the DW replacement for the old Ludwig bass drum hoop mounted cymbal stand. And DW does make a proper cymbal upright that is designed to work specifically with that sort of setup. And I think Neil Peart used that or something like it a time or two on his various setups. Now, I've mounted an ordinary DW cymbal arm, just a regular 912 cymbal arm, and that's hooked into a mini dog bone because I wanted as little weight on this as possible. I tried it with a full-size dog bone and it just seemed like a bit much. So mini dog bone comes off. You can hang out there for a bit. And so what you're left with is this clever little DW bass drum hoop clamp and an L-rod, which also comes in the package, and you can flip it either way around. So I chose to put the 1/2 inch part up so that it would work with the dog bone and the cymbal arm. But this basically uses a drum key to tighten this claw hook here, which is a standard DW bass drum claw hook, against this other casting, which grabs underneath the bass drum head and squeezes the whole affair together, and it doesn't affect the tuning of the drum head. It's not moving the head of the hoop in relation to the shell, it's just putting those two ever closer together than they were when they started, I guess. But in any event, it's very solid. Again, another part that I have wailed away on with reckless abandon, and it hasn't hurt anything. So I call that a good setup, and definitely a better replacement for the original Ludwig design with its kind of a 60s style bass drum hoop clamp designed for players who probably weren't going to hit it very hard. So anyway, that's a look at some of the cymbal mounting techniques that I came up with when I was in high school and their modern counterparts that I was able to employ 30 years later in order to construct this sort of a higher quality version of what I used to play around on when I was 17. And I got the pictures to prove it. By the way, notice anything familiar about this setup? More on that later. I'm Mike Lindsay. Thanks for coming out.
Or something like that. That's a good place to quit.
And now if you'll excuse me, it is actually taco time.